shadowy annals of American true crime, few cases have inspired as much intrigue, fear, and obsessive speculation as the mystery of the Zodiac Killer. Operating in Northern California during the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Zodiac was not just a murderer. He was a manipulator, a psychological terrorist who turned homicide into a cryptic game. Through a series of chilling letters, ciphers, and brazen communications sent to newspapers and law enforcement, the Zodiac taunted investigators and the public alike, fashioning himself as a ghostly entity beyond capture or comprehension. While his confirmed kill count stands at 5, the killer claimed to have murdered as many as 37 victims, and some researchers believe the true number may never be known. The Zodiac case is remarkable not only for the violence of the attacks, but for the way the killer inserted himself into the cultural narrative. He named himself Zodiac in one of his early letters, adorned his messages with occult symbols, and challenged the public to solve encrypted codes that he promised would reveal his identity. The police, despite massive investigations and over 2,500 suspects interviewed, failed to capture him. Over the decades, the Zodiac Killer evolved from a real threat into a mythologized figure, becoming the subject of books, documentaries, and major Hollywood films. The case is now a cornerstone of the true crime genre, endlessly dissected by professionals and amateur sleuths alike. What continues to haunt both investigators and the public is not only the brutality of the crimes, but also the enigma of the killer's identity and motives. Who was the Zodiac? What drove him to commit these crimes? And why did he vanish so abruptly? How did he evade justice, despite the intense media coverage and the largest manhunt of its time? And what does the enduring obsession with this case reveal about society's fascination with evil and the unknown? This video aims to provide a comprehensive and detailed exploration of the Zodiac Killer case. It will examine the confirmed murders and possible additional victims, decode the infamous letters and ciphers, delve into the investigations and primary suspects, and assess the psychological profile of the killer. It will also analyze the media's role in amplifying the Zodiac's reach and legacy, explore the cultural impact of the case, and discuss the modern theories and forensic developments that continue to emerge more than 50 years later. In doing so, this video not only revisits a terrifying chapter of American criminal history, but also attempts to understand why, even in an age of digital surveillance and advanced forensic science, the Zodiac Killer remains a chilling symbol of the ultimate unsolved mystery. The Zodiac Killer's reign of terror officially began on December 20th, 1968, though some researchers argue he may have started earlier. Over the next several years, he would be definitively linked to 5 brutal murders and 2 attempted killings across Northern California. Each attack bore distinct elements of premeditation, manipulation, and symbolic communication. Unlike most serial killers of the time, the Zodiac did not rely on a singular method or victim type. His unpredictability made him particularly terrifying. Lake Herman Road, December 20th, 1968. The first confirmed victims were Betty Lou Jensen, 16, and David Faraday, 17, a high school couple on their first date. That evening, the two drove to a well-known lover's lane on Lake Herman Road near Benicia, California. At around 11:15 p.m., their vehicle was found abandoned and riddled with bullets. David had been shot in the head at close range while still inside the car, and Betty Lou was discovered a short distance away, shot 5 times in the back as she tried to flee. There were no signs of robbery or sexual assault. Investigators found shell casings from a .22 caliber semi-automatic weapon and noted that the killer likely approached the vehicle, forced the couple out at gunpoint, and executed them. The calculated nature of the crime raised concerns, but it was not immediately linked to a serial killer. Blue Rock Springs, July 4th, 1969. 6 months later, on Independence Day, the killer struck again, this time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. At approximately midnight, Darlene Farron, 22, and Michael Mago, 19, were sitting in Darlene's car when a vehicle pulled in behind them and then drove off, only to return minutes later. A man stepped out, approached the passenger side, and fired 5 shots with a 9mm pistol. Both victims were hit, but miraculously, Michael survived. 40 minutes later, the Vallejo Police Department received a call from a man who claimed responsibility for both this attack and the Lake Herman Road murders. The call was traced to a phone booth just blocks from the police station. For the first time, the Zodiac had made contact. Michael Mago later described the shooter as a heavy-set white male, around 5'8", tall, wearing dark clothing. Lake Berryessa, September 27, 1969. This attack demonstrated the killer's evolving methods and theatrical flair. On a sunny afternoon at Lake Berryessa, Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, were picnicking when a man in an executioner-style hood, wearing a black bib with a white crosshair symbol, approached them holding a gun and a knife. He claimed he was an escaped convict and needed their car and money to get to Mexico. The man tied them up with pre-cut lengths of rope, then stabbed both multiple times. Brian survived by playing dead, but Cecilia succumbed to her wounds 2 days later. The killer left a handwritten message on the car door, including the dates of his previous attacks and his now iconic crosshair symbol. This attack marked a clear shift from drive-by or ambush shootings to a more intimate and sadistic form of violence. The chilling calmness of the killer's voice, as recounted by Brian, suggested a man fully in control, perhaps even enjoying the act. Presidio Heights, October 11, 1969. Unlike the previous rural or isolated settings, the Zodiac's next attack occurred in a crowded city, San Francisco. At around 9:55 p.m., Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, picked up a passenger who directed him to the upscale neighborhood of Presidio Heights. When the cab reached its destination, the passenger shot Stein in the head and took his wallet, keys, and a piece of his shirt. A group of teenagers witnessed the incident from across the street and called the police. Unfortunately, due to a communication error, the suspect was initially described as black, allowing the actual perpetrator, believed to be a white Malay, to walk away unchallenged. A partial fingerprint was found on the cab, and a bloody swatch of Stein's shirt was mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle in a letter later, confirming the Zodiac's responsibility. This marked the last confirmed Zodiac killing, yet the killer's taunting letters and threats continued for years, suggesting either a withdrawal from murder or a successful evasion of detection. The Zodiac himself claimed to have killed as many as 37 people, though only 5 murders and 2 attempted murders have been definitively linked to him. Several unsolved cases have been examined for possible connections. Cherry Jo Bates, October 30th, 1966. 18-year-old Cherry Jo Bates was murdered outside the Riverside City College library 3 years before the Zodiac's first confirmed killing. She was stabbed multiple times and nearly decapitated. A series of taunting typed letters followed the murder, including one titled The Confession, and a later letter claimed the writer would strike again. Years later, the Riverside police received an anonymous letter suggesting that Bates was a Zodiac victim. Handwriting comparisons have fueled speculation, though the Zodiac himself denied involvement in a later letter. Kathleen Johns, March 22, 1970. Johns was a young mother driving with her infant daughter near Modesto, California, when a man flagged her down, claiming her car had a mechanical issue. He offered to drive her to a service station, but instead drove her around for over an hour before she escaped. The suspect bore a resemblance to the composite sketch of the Zodiac, and months later, the killer claimed credit for the abduction in one of his letters. Although Kathleen survived and identified the man as the Zodiac, there was no physical evidence to confirm the connection. Donna Last, September 6, 1970. A 25-year-old nurse who vanished from South Lake Tahoe, Last was never found. The Zodiac sent a postcard to the Chronicle alluding to her disappearance, prompting speculation. However, police have never conclusively linked him to the case. Unlike most serial killers who develop a fixed pattern, the Zodiac's modus operandi shifted frequently. Weapons. He used both firearms, .22 and 9mm pistols, and knives. Locations. From isolated lovers' lanes to urban streets. Victims. Couples. A lone taxi driver. And potentially a young woman and child. Messaging. He took credit through letters, used ciphers, drew symbolic imagery, and referenced pop culture. This fluidity and theatricality in his approach made profiling him more difficult. Each attack seemed designed not only to kill, but to control the narrative. ensuring the media and law enforcement would chase his shadows. The Zodiac Killer's murder spree was marked by brutality, calculation, and performance. His crimes weren't merely acts of violence. They were staged messages to society. Through them, he cultivated fear, sparked national obsession, and manipulated the press. Unlike many serial killers who fade into obscurity upon death or capture, the Zodiac's mystique has grown in the absence of resolution. His known victims are more than entries in a cold case file. They are tragic milestones in a uniquely American criminal saga that still refuses to close. More than his brutal crimes, it was the Zodiac Killer's communications that elevated him from a regional menace to a national nightmare. Between 1969 and 1974, the Zodiac sent dozens of letters, postcards, and ciphers to newspapers, law enforcement, and private citizens. In these, he taunted investigators, confessed to murders, both confirmed and unconfirmed, and threatened mass violence. Often adorned with bizarre symbols and codes, the communications weren't just an extension of his crimes, they were a calculated performance, a psychological warfare campaign against society. On August 1st, 1969, just weeks after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, 3 nearly identical letters were received by the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald. Each began with the chilling salutation, "No, dear editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman." In these letters, the writer provided details only the killer could know, including the victims' positions and the types of bullets used. But most disturbing was the cipher attached to each letter. 1/3 of a 408-character puzzle the killer demanded be published on the front pages of each paper. He warned that if they refused, he would embark on a weekend killing spree, targeting lone people in the night and shooting them until he had killed a dozen people. The newspapers complied. This was the world's first glimpse of the name Zodiac, and of the crosshair symbol that would become his twisted signature. 3 days later, he would use that name for the first time. The full cipher was cracked within a week, not by the FBI or police, but by a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty. The decrypted message read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." The message offered no identity, despite the Zodiac's earlier claim it would. Instead, it provided insight into his twisted mind. A cold, detached predator who reveled in domination and dehumanization. He ended the message ominously. "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." This concept of collecting souls, as if he were more than a man, added a layer of mysticism to his madness. On November 8, 1969, the Zodiac mailed his most infamous puzzle, a new cipher composed of 340 symbols, mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle with a card declaring, "This is the Zodiac speaking." For over 50 years, the so-called Z340 cipher remained unsolved, frustrating both amateur cryptologists and professional codebreakers alike. Finally, in December 2020, an international team of codebreakers, David Ornchak, Jarl Van Eyck, and Sam Blake, cracked it using custom software and pattern analysis. The decrypted text read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to Paratus all the sooner. I have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach Paratus." While the cipher did not reveal his identity, it confirmed his delusions of grandeur, obsession with the afterlife, and sadistic pride in eluding capture. The reference to a TV show is believed to allude to the Jim Dunbar call-in show, during which a man claiming to be the Zodiac had phoned in, though authorities later dismissed the caller as a hoaxer. The Zodiac sent over 24 letters, each rich with unsettling content. Highlights include, sent to reporter Paul Avery. This hand-decorated card included a note, "Peekaboo, you are doomed." It was decorated with skeletons and the number 14 beneath a strange crosshair. Many interpreted this as a claim to 14 victims, though only 5 were officially confirmed at the time. In several communications, the Zodiac described a plan to bomb a school bus, stating he would shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. This threat prompted mass panic, school lockdowns, and a heavy police presence throughout California. He even sent diagrams of the bus bomb, showcasing his desire to instill fear on a public scale far beyond his actual body count. The Zodiac frequently quoted Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado, using its lyrics to justify his killings and position himself as a judge and executioner. Theatrical references added a surreal, almost performative flair to his letters, distinguishing him from other killers. One of the final confirmed letters was sent to the Chronicle, mocking the film The Exorcist as the best satirical comedy I have ever seen. It included yet another cipher, known as the Exorcist cipher, which remains unsolved. The letter ended with a crosshair in the count Me37 SFPD 0. Throughout his letters, the Zodiac demonstrated a fascination with symbols, language, and control. He used crosshairs as his personal logo. Often ended letters with kill counts, Me10, played with spelling and grammar, possibly intentional to confuse profilers. Inserted anagrams, backward writing, and symbolic puns. Introduced a mysterious 13-symbol cipher on April 20th, 1970, which remains unsolved. Some theorists believe these symbols held occult significance, pointing to astrology, alchemy, or Masonic codes. Others view them as deliberate misdirection meant to give an illusion of deeper meaning. What made the Zodiac unique among serial killers was his mastery of media manipulation. By directly engaging with newspapers, he kept himself in the headlines and maintained public interest and fear. The press served as his amplifier, broadcasting his threats, puzzles, and philosophical musings to millions. He forced the police to play his game by sending clues, dares, and riddles. The line between killer and performer blurred. In many ways, the Zodiac shaped the modern archetype of the serial killer as celebrity, a criminal who crafts a persona to ensure lasting infamy. Whereas the Zodiac's letters and ciphers were more than evidence. They were manifestos of control, identity, and power. Through these chilling communications, he transformed a series of brutal crimes into an enduring psychological enigma. Despite decades of analysis by cryptologists, FBI profilers, and cyber sleuths, many of the Zodiac's messages remain unsolved or only partially understood. They are echoes of a killer who spoke not just in blood, but in symbols, leaving behind a trail of fear encrypted in language, and a haunting silence where his name should have been. The Zodiac Killer investigation is one of the most extensive and frustrating manhunts in American criminal history. Despite eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, fingerprints, letters, and even partial DNA profiles, the identity of the killer has never been confirmed. Over the decades, law enforcement agencies interviewed more than 2,500 suspects, pursued hundreds of tips, and developed multiple psychological and behavioral profiles. Yet the Zodiac remained a phantom, present in taunts and letters, but absent from the reach of justice. The Zodiac's crimes occurred across multiple jurisdictions: Vallejo, Benicia, Napa County, San Francisco, and possibly Riverside. Each local law enforcement agency launched its own investigation, but communication and cooperation were inconsistent during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Vallejo Police Department, the first agency to confront the killer's letters and phone calls, handled the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs cases. The Napa County Sheriff's Office investigated the Lake Berryessa stabbings. The San Francisco Police Department, SFPD, took the lead on the Presidio Heights murder of Paul Stine. The lack of centralized coordination, coupled with competition and differing investigative standards, may have hindered progress. In later years, the California Department of Justice, DOJ, and FBI became involved, attempting to consolidate efforts and evidence, including fingerprints and DNA samples. Several pieces of physical and circumstantial evidence were gathered throughout the investigation. Though compelling, none have conclusively identified the Zodiac. Fingerprints. A bloody latent fingerprint was found on the driver's side door of Paul Stine's cab. Partial prints were also lifted from Zodiac's letters and envelopes. However, these prints were incomplete or smudged, and experts disagree on whether they definitively belong to the killer. In the early 2000s, saliva traces from the backs of stamps and envelope flaps were tested for DNA. A partial DNA profile was developed, but it was not complete enough for legal identification. Critics have raised concerns that the stamps may have been licked by someone else, a decoy, an assistant, or a moistener, muddying the reliability of the DNA source. The Zodiac's letters were submitted for handwriting analysis. A distinctive, angular, all-capital style became a key signature. While analysts developed a profile, matching it definitively to a suspect has remained problematic, as handwriting is not admissible as definitive evidence in court. The only eyewitness composite sketch of the Zodiac came from the Presidio Heights murder. Teenagers who witnessed the killer fleeing Paul Stein's cab described a white male, 5'8" to 5'10", stocky build, round face, light brown or reddish hair, possibly wearing horn-rimmed glasses. A police artist drew a composite sketch based on their description. However, due to an initial dispatch error describing the suspect as black, nearby police units let a white man matching the actual description walk away, believing he wasn't the suspect. This blunder has haunted the case ever since. Over 2,500 suspects have been questioned, but only a few have consistently remained in public and investigative focus. Here are the most discussed. Arthur Lee Allen. The most well-known suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, was a former school teacher and convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo. Multiple circumstantial elements drew suspicion. He was in the area at the time of several murders, owned a typewriter and a watch brand named Zodiac, was allegedly fascinated by cryptography and the concept of the most dangerous game. His friends reported disturbing behavior, and he made incriminating statements about wanting to kill people. Despite strong suspicion, no physical evidence ever linked Allen to the Zodiac crimes. His handwriting did not match the letters, and the DNA from the envelopes reportedly excluded him. Allen died in 1992, and no charges were ever filed. Rick Marshall. A former projectionist and film buff, Rick Marshall was suspected due to his proximity to the crimes, his background in electronics, matching Zodiac's bomb threats, his odd behavior and reclusiveness. He became the basis for the suspect in David Fincher's 2007 film, Zodiac. However, handwriting and fingerprint comparisons failed to support the theory. Like Allen, Marshall was never charged and passed away in 2008. Lawrence Kane. A real estate agent and Navy veteran with a neurological disorder, Kane was considered a suspect because he matched the physical description given by Kathleen Johns and others. He lived near victims and crime scenes. He had a history of stalking and violent behavior. Kane's medical condition, which affected memory and impulse control, added psychological intrigue, but no conclusive evidence ever tied him to the crimes. Gary Francis Post. In 2021, a group of independent investigators called the Casebreakers claimed that the Zodiac killer was Gary Francis Post, a deceased Air Force veteran and house painter. They cited similarity to the composite sketch, cryptic anagram-based ciphers that allegedly spell out his name, scars on his forehead matching eyewitness reports. However, law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and SFPD, disputed the claim, stating there was no official evidence linking Post to the Zodiac case. The announcement drew media attention, but was widely criticized for lack of transparency and peer-reviewed methodology. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and independent profilers attempted to build a psychological profile of Zodiac killer, likely a white male, aged 25-40 during the killings. Intelligent, possibly with military or law enforcement training. Deep need for control and attention. Socially isolated, possibly suffering from narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial traits. Fascinated with puzzles, games, and mythology. May have stopped killing due to fear of exposure, incarceration, illness, or death. Despite this profile, the wide range of possible personality types and lack of DNA confirmation makes the list of potential suspects broad and elusive. Several factors contributed to the Zodiac's ability to evade justice. jurisdictional conflicts, and poor coordination. Lack of advanced forensic technology at the time. The killer's ability to change tactics and not follow a predictable pattern. Potential forensic contamination of evidence. The passage of time and degradation of physical samples. Furthermore, the Zodiac may have deliberately stopped killing or significantly altered his methods to avoid detection, effectively retiring his persona and escaping scrutiny. More than 5 decades after his last confirmed attack, the Zodiac Killer remains one of the most enigmatic figures in criminal history. Despite thousands of leads, multiple suspects, and tireless efforts by law enforcement and civilians alike, his true identity remains locked behind smudged fingerprints, incomplete DNA, and cryptic letters. The investigation itself has become part of the Zodiac mythos, a case where the trail always seems to vanish just before the truth can be grasped. Whether the killer died, stopped, or continued under another name, he succeeded in his ultimate goal, to remain a phantom forever beyond the reach of justice. Serial killers are often remembered not only for their crimes, but also for the chilling insight they offer into the darkest recesses of the human psyche. In the case of the Zodiac Killer, the psychological portrait is particularly complex, partly because he was never caught, and partly because he cultivated a persona that blended sadism, narcissism, theatricality, and delusions of grandeur. The Zodiac Killer did not just want to kill, he wanted to be noticed, feared, and admired. His obsessive need for media coverage and correspondence with the press suggests classic narcissistic personality traits, including grandiosity, repeatedly referred to himself as superior, often mocking the police in public for failing to capture him. Need for admiration, demanded his ciphers and letters be published and threatened further violence if ignored. Sense of entitlement, believed he had the right to kill and even threaten mass murder if his ego was not fed by media attention. Lack of empathy, showed no remorse for victims, instead treating murder as a game or art form. These traits are consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, as defined by the DSM-5. However, the Zodiac's behavior also overlapped with traits of antisocial personality disorder, particularly in his manipulation, deceitfulness, and callous disregard for human life. A defining feature of the Zodiac's crimes, especially at Lake Berryessa, was the use of fear and prolonged control. Rather than killing swiftly and leaving the scene, the Zodiac took the time to tie his victims, speak to them, and then stab them, all while wearing a costume that suggested ritual or performance. This behavior points towards sexual or power-based sadism, even though there was no confirmed sexual assault. Criminologists categorize such killers as deriving satisfaction not necessarily from the act of sex or murder, but from the domination and psychological torture of victims. The Zodiac's letters, filled with promises of eternal servitude from his victims in the afterlife, further reveal a deep need to possess and control not just bodies, but souls. His obsession with the idea of victims becoming slaves for the afterlife may have been symbolic of his ultimate fantasy, to exist as a godlike figure with total command over life and death. The Zodiac demonstrated considerable intelligence, particularly in the creation of his cryptograms. His knowledge of encryption methods, code theory, and symbolic language, cultural and literary references suggests that he was well-read and possibly self-taught, with a penchant for puzzles and abstract thinking. The complexity of the Z340 cipher, which went unsolved for over 50 years, supports the theory that the killer had a mind tuned to logical pattern recognition and delayed gratification, traits associated with high-functioning psychopaths. He often referenced works like The Most Dangerous Game, The Mikado, and The Exorcist, indicating an awareness of psychological symbolism and cultural context. His use of crosshairs, occult symbols, and phrases like by knife, by gun, or I am the Zodiac was a form of self-branding rarely seen in criminal history before him. The Zodiac did not simply commit crimes. He crafted performances, sometimes complete with costumes, staging, and symbolism. His outfit at Lake Berryessa, a black executioner-style hood marked with a crosshair, was unprecedented in the annals of serial murder. These theatrical gestures suggest that the killer saw himself not just as a murderer, but as a performer or mythmaker. He carefully curated his public image through his interactions with the press, often speaking in riddles and moral inversions. "I like killing people because it's so much fun. I shall be reborn in paradise. School children make nice targets." He was not just trying to kill, he was trying to sculpt fear into legend, a desire more aligned with psychopathy combined with a Machiavellian worldview. One of the most disturbing implications of the Zodiac killer's behavior is that he may have lived a relatively ordinary life outside his crimes. Unlike notorious serial killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, who were eventually exposed by personal failings or overconfidence, the Zodiac left no trace in his day-to-day identity. Experts believe this implies strong compartmentalization, the ability to lead a double life, concealing murderous impulses behind a mask of normalcy. This is often seen in organized serial killers, who have steady employment, possess average to high IQs, are socially functional, though often reclusive, exhibit planning and foresight in their crimes. The Zodiac's ability to disappear after the murder of Paul Stein, even with eyewitnesses and evidence nearby, further suggests a man who was calm under pressure, self-controlled, and methodical. While most psychological theories suggest that the Zodiac was not clinically insane, some aspects of his writing hint at psychotic delusions, particularly his references to paradis, slaves in the afterlife, and eternal vengeance. These themes might indicate delusional thinking or a mild psychosis, though more likely they were part of his carefully crafted mythology. His references to God, morality, and eternal justice could have been manipulations intended to confuse profilers and law enforcement, an effective tactic if so. The Zodiac killer was more than a murderer. He was a manipulator of fear, an architect of mystery, and a dark mirror of society's own obsessions with power and spectacle. His psychological profile reveals a deeply disturbed individual who operated at the intersection of high intellect, emotional detachment, narcissistic rage, and symbolic violence. That he may have walked among ordinary people, unnoticed and untouched by justice, adds another layer to the horror of his legacy. He was, in the truest sense, a ghost who screamed not through haunting, but through headlines, letters, and the twisted riddles he left behind. More than half a century after his crimes, the Zodiac killer remains one of the most iconic figures in American true crime lore, not simply because of the horror he inflicted, but because of how deeply he embedded himself into the fabric of popular culture. Unlike most serial killers, the Zodiac actively shaped his own legend, carefully curating a public persona through taunting letters, cryptic symbols, and mythic threats. The result was not merely a string of crimes, but the construction of a media mythos, sustained through decades of books, films, television shows, podcasts, and public obsession. The Zodiac killer was not content to let the press find him. He went to them, directly mailing his ciphers and confessions to newspapers like the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner. He leveraged the media not only to generate fear, but to craft a lasting identity, coining his own nickname, the Zodiac, creating a personal logo, the crosshair symbol, and even managing his public relations by reacting to how he was portrayed in news coverage. This strategy was unprecedented. Previous killers may have earned headlines, but the Zodiac orchestrated his own narrative, blurring the line between reality and performance. As crime journalist Robert Graysmith would later note, the Zodiac understood how to use the press like a scalpel, carving his image into the American consciousness. His public correspondence with the media was essentially a performance art of terror, and the public, captivated and horrified, became both audience and participant. The Zodiac murders occurred at a time when television and print journalism were becoming increasingly sensational. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw the rise of "if it bleeds, it leads" journalism, and the Zodiac's cryptic flair was irresistible content. Headlines about his ciphers, bus bomb threats, and mysterious messages flooded local and national papers. The public response was overwhelming. Readers flooded newspapers with attempted cipher solutions. Talk radio shows debated his motives and identity. Parents feared for their children after Zodiac threatened to kill school buses full of children. Amateur sleuths and conspiracy theorists began forming their own Zodiac task forces. This was one of the earliest instances of a true crime media circus, where the criminal not only dominated the headlines, but became a recurring character in the public imagination, a dynamic we now see in cases like Ted Bundy, the BTK killer, and the Unabomber. The Zodiac's influence on film and television is both direct and diffuse. He has appeared as himself in documentaries and films, but has also inspired dozens of fictional killers who mirror his methods and mystique. Some key examples include Dirty Harry, 1971. This Clint Eastwood classic was directly inspired by the Zodiac case. The film's villain, Scorpio, mimics the Zodiac's penchant for threatening the city, demanding ransoms, and targeting random victims. The movie portrays the killer as a nihilistic terrorist and paints law enforcement as lone warriors in a bureaucratic system, an archetype that would dominate crime fiction for decades. Perhaps the most meticulous depiction of the case, this film is based on Robert Graysmith's books and centers on the obsessive toll the investigation took on journalists and detectives. Fincher's atmospheric, procedural tone avoids sensationalism, instead portraying the killer as an unknowable force, more enigma than man. Critics praised it for realism and haunting ambiguity, and it helped revive public interest in the case. The Zodiac has been referenced in episodes of Criminal Minds, Mindhunter, American Horror Story, and The X-Files. Many fictional killers, such as the Riddler in the Batman 2022, borrow from his cipher-heavy style and media manipulation. Documentaries like The Hunt for the Zodiac Killer and Zodiac Killer Tapes keep the mystery alive through reinvestigations and dramatizations. These portrayals continually shift between factual analysis and myth-making, ensuring the Zodiac remains a cinematic and literary archetype of the anonymous, brilliant killer. Beyond Hollywood, the Zodiac has been dissected in countless true crime books and essays. The most influential texts include Robert Graysmith's Zodiac, 1986, and its sequel, Zodiac Unmasked, 2002, which introduced Arthur Lee Allen as a prime suspect and redefined the case for a new generation. Paul Avery's journalism, which shaped early public understanding of the case and received a personal threat from the Zodiac. 18. Academic works on criminal profiling and forensic psychology, which use the Zodiac as a case study in organized narcissistic killers. The Zodiac also appears in fiction novels, from thrillers to historical mysteries, often as a cipher for chaos or a metaphor for the limits of human understanding. In the 21st century, the Zodiac case found new life online, spawning thousands of forums, YouTube channels, Reddit communities, and podcasts. Amateur sleuths began combing through old police files, proposing alternative suspects, and even developing new methods of decryption. Some major developments from the online community include the 2020 decryption of the Z340 cipher, which was solved not by law enforcement, but by a team of international code breakers using modern computing. Ongoing debates around handwriting, anagrams, and linguistic forensics. Case breakers groups proposing new suspects like Gary Francis Post. The Zodiac's presence in the digital world reflects our growing cultural obsession with unsolved mysteries, as well as our belief in crowdsourced justice. The case has become a living archive, constantly updated, theorized, and reconstructed in real time by a global community. At this point, the Zodiac Killer has transcended mere biography and become a symbol of fear, of anonymity, of the limits of justice. He represents the terror of the random predator, a killer who strikes without clear motive, the failure of institutions, a case that eluded police, the FBI, and even modern forensic science, the rise of media-manipulated criminality, a person who becomes infamous not for the scale of his crimes, but for the myth he created around them. He is a mythical figure, like Jack the Ripper or the Black Dahlia Killer, who serves as a cautionary tale about the seduction of mystery and the danger of glamorizing evil. The Zodiac Killer's legacy is no longer confined to police files or crime scenes. He exists now in a vast cultural echo chamber, from cinema screens to Reddit threads, From podcast episodes to pop culture references, he is a reminder of how murder and myth can intertwine, how a single individual can use fear and performance to etch their name or symbol into history. The world may never know who the Zodiac really was, but in the shadows of media, art, and imagination, his presence endures. A ghost made not of flesh, but of fear, symbols, and unanswered questions. More than 50 years after the last confirmed Zodiac letter arrived in a San Francisco newsroom, the killer's shadow looms large over the annals of American true crime. Unlike other serial murderers who have been caught, tried, or at least definitively identified, the Zodiac killer remains a figure of perpetual ambiguity, a name without a face, a mind without a body. His impact endures not only because of the horror of his crimes, but because of what he represents, the enduring failure of certainty in an age obsessed with answers. The Zodiac occupies a singular position among serial killers in American history. While other murderers, such as Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, or Jeffrey Dahmer, were eventually captured and publicly dissected, the Zodiac has resisted that fate. His crimes were not the most numerous, nor the most gruesome, yet his symbolic power far exceeds the scope of his confirmed acts. Criminologists frequently cite the Zodiac as the prototypical organized killer. He planned his attacks with precision, evaded capture by exploiting jurisdictional weaknesses, left just enough clues to tantalize, but never enough to solve. He is often compared to Jack the Ripper, whose brief but savage spree in Victorian London similarly gripped the public imagination and eluded justice. Like the Ripper, the Zodiac's true weapon was fear itself, and his mastery of manipulation ensured his place in the criminal pantheon. And, despite decades of investigation and speculation, the true identity of the Zodiac remains unknown. However, several theories and suspects continue to dominate discussions. The man most widely believed to have been the Zodiac, Allen, was never officially charged, but remains the prime suspect in popular culture. Handwriting, DNA, and fingerprint evidence have cast doubt on this theory. Yet his odd behavior, background in cryptography, and proximity to crime scenes continue to fuel belief in his guilt. In 2021, the Casebreakers team proposed Post as the Zodiac, citing photographs, scar patterns, and supposed hidden anagrams in the ciphers. Their claims have been met with skepticism by law enforcement and experts, who argue the evidence is circumstantial at best and lacks forensic credibility. Still, the case has inspired more fringe and speculative theories, including that the Zodiac was actually multiple individuals, that he was a law enforcement officer using insider knowledge, that he faked his own death or left the country, that the Zodiac's crimes were a cover for espionage or occult activity. What all these theories reflect is the black hole at the center of the mystery, a hunger for resolution that has never been satisfied and may never be. The Zodiac case exposed serious flaws in law enforcement coordination during the 1960s and 1970s. The killer operated across multiple jurisdictions, often playing one department against another and exploiting bureaucratic delays in information sharing. This case helped catalyze the development of centralized criminal databases, the early use of criminal profiling, particularly by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, greater collaboration between local, state, and federal agencies. Though it came too late to catch the Zodiac, these changes shaped how serial crimes are handled today. More recently, advances in DNA technology, such as those used to capture the Golden State Killer via familial DNA, have rekindled hope that the Zodiac may still be identified if viable genetic material can be recovered from preserved evidence. At its core, the Zodiac case is not just a story about murder. It is a story about the limits of knowledge, the chaos beneath civilized society, and the power of myth. The Zodiac seemed to understand this intuitively. He knew that by remaining unknown, he would become immortal. In a chilling way, he was correct. While other killers have faded from public memory, the Zodiac is more famous now than he was during his active years. His unsolved status gives him narrative immortality, a puzzle that resists the finality of solution. There is something almost literary about the way his story unfolds. The cryptic letters and symbols, the taunting of authority, The blend of classical references with barbaric acts. The way he seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only terror and questions. In this sense, the Zodiac becomes more than a criminal. He becomes a symbol of modern anxiety, the fear that we can never fully know who lives beside us, that evil can be hidden behind normality, and that sometimes, despite our best efforts, there will be no answer. One of the most striking aspects of the Zodiac legacy is how it transformed the public from passive observers into active participants. People around the world have tried their hand at decoding his ciphers, analyzing handwriting, creating suspect lists, and building timelines. This participatory culture, amplified by the internet, reflects a shift in how we engage with crime stories. We no longer wait for law enforcement to solve mysteries. We try to solve them ourselves. The Zodiac was, perhaps, one of the first cases where this dynamic took hold in real time. Yet this democratization of investigation also has its pitfalls. Innocent people have been harassed due to misidentification. False theories are spread as fact. The killer's mythos is sometimes glorified rather than condemned. This raises ethical questions about how society balances curiosity, justice, and respect for victims when dealing with unsolved, mythologized crime. As the decades roll on, it becomes increasingly likely that the Zodiac will never be identified with certainty. Key suspects have died, evidence has degraded, and institutional memory has faded. And yet the case remains eternally alive, in books, films, theories, and nightmares. What makes the Zodiac so haunting is not just that he was never caught, but that he designed his crimes to outlast capture. He understood how to weaponize ambiguity, to create a symbol rather than a body. In doing so, he forced the world into a maddening game where each clue only leads to another question. The Zodiac killer may be gone. He may be dead. He may have never existed in the form we imagine. But in the minds of those who seek justice, answers, or simply understanding, he will never truly disappear.